We're living through a period of time in the 21st century when most of the major presuppositions built into mainstream politics are proving to be false. Now, I'm not a radical. I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not a communist. I'm not an anarchist. If you stick around and watch some more videos on this channel, you'll see I'm a critic of all of those tendencies, all of those organized political factions. However, I'm a mainstream, moderate pragmatist who's willing to admit that most of the political assumptions that seemed unassailable and sacrosanct 200 years ago are now revealed to basically be nonsense. Think about, as an easy example, the separation of powers doctrine. That was what revolutionary France was built on. That was what the United States of America and its constitutional tradition were built on. And if you think about what it's supposed to promise, what it's supposed to deliver, what it's supposed to protect, what it's supposed to ensure, it's just nonsense. And nobody even debates it. Nobody even cares. Right now, the streets of Portland, Oregon, a city of only 2 million people, have been on fire for 40 days continuously. We're having debates at various levels of profundity and shallowness about policing, not only in the United States of America, but also, interestingly, in France, two countries that are very much linked by their revolutionary tradition, by their first constitutions of that era in the 18th century. Have you read the French Constitution? It was written after World War II. It's not ancient, but it reflects and continues ancient errors. Do you think you're going to find anything about the relationship between the police and the average citizen on the street in that Constitution? Again, read the American Constitution, which has more recent amendments, but the document itself dates back to the American Revolution. You're going to find anything about the relationship between the police and members of the public. I've commented on this in other videos. And when you actually look at the ideology that surrounded, pervaded, and underpinned the writing of those constitutions, for example, the philosophy of the separation of powers doctrine found in the Baron de Montesquieu's book, L'Esprit des Lois, nobody's talking about that on the streets of Portland, Oregon in 2020. Nobody's talking about that in the Black Lives Matter movement. And from my perspective, the greatest tragedy of all is that all of the phony radicalism of the year 2020 is destined to rise and fall and be forgotten without changing a goddamn thing. We have several recent parallels in Western politics, and I am not saying this to ridicule the pious intentions of the protesters involved, but as a pragmatist to learn from their failure. Extinction Rebellion occupied the streets of London, England, cost millions and millions of dollars in damages with a so-called peaceful protest that, from my perspective, was not terribly peaceful. From their perspective, was maximally disruptive. They use the term disruptive rather than peaceful protest. I just note enormous cost to the taxpayer. And, of course, some people went to prison and some damage done to property and so on. That can be evaluated. The pious good intentions of the protesters can be debated. The outcomes cannot. Extinction Rebellion rose and fell, and not a goddamn thing changed. Nothing was accomplished. Point to one piece of legislation, point to one positive outcome from their movement. And what are they trying to do now? With their little YouTube channel, they're trying to rub their magical social media sticks together and get a spark of public interest again to just repeat exactly the same strategy over again, to the same methods. And I notice they're now using more explicitly Marxist rhetoric of class warfare. They're now claiming they're going to organize the working class against other classes. Before, they tried to claim they were above such petty political distinctions, but I guess times change. Anyway, they're trying to rile up the masses once again to have the same kind of quote disruptive unquote protest. However much you might sympathize with the outcomes that the protesters involved in Black Lives Matter or the particular anarchist groups in Portland, Oregon, if you sympathize with the outcomes they say they're pursuing, you have to admit to yourself, this is not the way to get there. Now, in the case of Extinction Rebellion, I don't sympathize with the outcomes they're pursuing. I don't sympathize with the methods. I reject the whole thing entirely. I question the whole thing entirely, and I think I've questioned it fruitfully. I think I quite accurately predicted what would happen with that movement in my assessment of what it was, stage by stage, and we can now sit back and see the outcomes. And if you were one of the people who devoted hundreds of hours of your time just as a volunteer, or who ended up spending thousands of hours of your time in prison, you might look back on your life years later and wonder about the opportunity cost, about what could have been done, what you could have accomplished just as one person with those hundreds of hours or those thousands of hours if you'd done something more productive. And then you scale it up. You think about all the other protesters who had hundreds of hours and thousands of hours and what they could have done or what you collectively could have done if you'd worked on something positive rather than something destructive or disruptive with that time. And of course, there's the other question of cost. If you're looking at the millions and millions of dollars that were cost to the taxpayer, there's a loss there too that can be measured. Now, so all of these same things, I don't think I need to repeat myself. If we can look at the rise and fall of Extinction Rebellion in England, and then we can take a glance to the United States of America and the rise and fall of public outrage following after the murder of George Floyd, all of the same questions can be asked. And tragically, I mean, I say this sincerely, tragically, we have to come to the same conclusions. Is this the way to arrive at a better organization of police or of the polity in the United States of America? The answer is no. And of course, I also am horrified by the murder of George Floyd. There are many ways in which I also can say I cry out for justice. And I'd like to see very fundamental changes in the organization of society. And that should probably start with discarding the Constitution you've got and writing an entirely new one. But that brings us to the most dangerous and difficult question of all. Who among us would write that Constitution? I've already had several videos devoted to the questions of who are the leaders of Black Lives Matter as an organization. Black Lives Matter as a catchphrase or as a hashtag is something very different from Black Lives Matter as an actual organization with actual leaders, and by the way, an actual bank account and actual donations, and they actually make money selling t-shirts. So I don't mean Black Lives Matter as the concept or the hashtag on Twitter. If we're talking about the leaders of the actual group as it's formally incorporated, its three founders, and so on, I've got to tell you, my conclusion is they are absolutely the wrong people to be asking those questions, answering those questions, researching what the solutions are, or writing new legislation. And I think you can tell I don't say that with any contempt in my heart. It's just you take a look at who they are, you take a look at their educational background, you take a look at the books they've written or contributed chapters to, you take a look at their interviews, you evaluate what they say themselves. And it's interesting to note when leaders of Black Lives Matter are interviewed and they're asked tough questions, which is rare. They're normally asked a lot of softball questions like, isn't it just wonderful to think that you started with this Twitter account and now you can change the world? They're asked a lot of questions of that. But when they're asked difficult questions like, if you defund the police, then you call 911 because you have an emergency, who answers the phone? They very often will give answers along the lines of, look, I'm not an expert. I don't have all the answers to those questions. And that precisely raises the problem of, who are the experts, or who is going to do the research? Who is going to have the answers to those questions? I think, again, there's a very close parallel between Extinction Rebellion in England and the disorganized protests and riots that erupted after the death of George Floyd. We can call them the Black Lives Matter protests of the year 2020. One of the most fundamental things they have in common is this: outpouring of anger, dissatisfaction, disruption, But fundamentally, what the protesters are doing is saying, here's the problem. Now we want the government to solve it. Now we want the government to fix it. And, Extinction Rebellion are actually explicit in articulating this. Extinction Rebellion, one of the reasons why, for example, they don't advocate veganism, they don't encourage a vegan diet, is because they say they do not advocate any particular solution. They merely advocate the importance of the problem and demands that the government do something to solve it. That's it. That's their agenda. So they're not going to get into veganism. They're not going to get into water quality questions or particular power plants or solar power versus wind generation. No details, no explanation. No. Just have the riots, make the demands, and then somebody else is going to solve the problem. And this is ultimately a very childlike attitude towards politics. The attitude is throw a tantrum and the grown-ups, they'll respond to your tantrum and solve your problems. And we, as the children throwing the tantrum, apparently don't have to be worried about the solutions. And that's what the demands to defund the police really are. They're a tantrum. And right now in Portland, in miniature, this is playing out again with even greater levels of absurdity. People seem to think that they have the civil right to literally assault the police and burn down police buildings and attack federal agents using fireworks, and they ought to be able to do so with impunity as a quote-unquote peaceful protest. Somehow doubt the authors of the Constitution had this in mind under the definition of peaceful protest at the time. And apparently federal agents have no right to respond with force. This is truly surreal in a country where if someone steps on your lawn, you're allowed to shoot them dead for trespassing. I mean, the rights of self-defense normal citizens have compared to these policemen and federal agents who were stuck inside a courthouse that was being assailed by explosives, mostly fireworks, and people tried to light it on fire. They were inside looking out at this. Yeah, so as I say, the generalized absurdities of the protests of 2020 were repeated in miniature and with greater intensity in Portland just in the last few weeks and the last few days. So my overall theme for this video is to draw your attention to the extent to which mainstream Western politics, not the left-wing fringes of communism and anarchism, and not the right-wing fringes either, not the right-wing libertarians or something, but the absolute center of pragmatic mainstream politics in the West is really based on a lot of completely false assumptions that rarely go examined or discussed in any profound way whatsoever. And of course, it's times like this, it's when you have real problems that they should be examined, and we should start to come up with new solutions, and we should start to reject those assumptions of the past. In my prior video, the one uploaded immediately before this, what I was indirectly doing was questioning the consensus gentium that's really attached to the intellectual legacy of John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was an author, he was a philosopher, he was also an elected politician. And what I'm saying now is what's attributed to John Stuart Mill. You might say it's Millism. I'm not so much directly quoting Mill's own works himself, and I know if you get into the details on this, you can find John Stuart Mill sometimes saying one thing and sometimes saying the exact opposite. He was a human being, he was a politician. It's not like quoting the Ten Commandments, put it that way. The overall concern John Stuart Mill had throughout his life, and this is really immortalized in his autobiography more than it is in any kind of particular manifesto or his writings about the philosophy of utilitarianism. His concern was about the ethical status of minorities in a democratic society. And what did he mean by minorities? It is stated incredibly politely and indirectly, but one of the things he had in mind was the status of sexual minorities, meaning homosexuals, gays, and lesbians, right? Now, at the time he wrote his autobiography, he cannot even admit this. I mean, it is so strangely censored or self-censored. You've really got to know what to read between those words. And, he's worried about how a man could lose his job and be kicked out of political office and be kind of hounded out of society in England at that time. If, for example, he should tire of the company of his wife and being unable to get a divorce, start living with another woman. And you understand, John Stuart Mill himself was never in that situation. He had a female friend, and some people said this was his situation, and she was married to another man. But that was a completely platonic friendship. How dare you think? I mean, it's interesting to note that one type of minority he was interested in, today we would be able to articulate very easily as the problem of gay rights, and that was an intensely, belligerently homophobic society, but also a society of Christian purity or Christian Puritanism, you could say, where people really did actively want to punish those who dared to cheat on their wives or ended up in these kinds of complex situations. They had one marriage that drifted apart. They hadn't lived in the same house for 10 years, and now they're sleeping with someone else. These things have always existed, but he was very sensitive to that. Other issues that interested him especially was the status of the British Empire in India. So you had, for him, obvious questions like the status of Indian people who were living in England, the status of the British Empire in India, and then also, for example, the treatment of Jews by a Christian majority country. All right. I say consensus gentium because what came out of these reflections and ruminations from John Stuart Mill, and what I was literally taught in the classroom on the chalkboard in a Canadian University Department of Political Science, was this. So the conclusion is, in a democracy, what you need is pluralism, is to divide the society up into hermetically sealed self-governing units where the majority does not have the opportunity to oppress the minority. Problem solved. So this grand design was followed in England and Canada. This grand design leads to Canada having Catholic schools funded by taxpayers. We don't have separation of church and state, where people raise their children steeped in Catholic doctrine and only knowing other Catholics, never being exposed to any other religion or worldview from cradle to the grave. And just a few blocks away in downtown Toronto, there's an Orthodox Jewish school. And a few blocks away, there's a Muslim fundamentalist school. And they're all entitled to taxpayers' money in this wonderful vision of a pluralistic society where each little ethnic minority gets to, in some strange way, self-govern. Oh, right, except for the indigenous people, right? Except for some reason, this logic just never extended to the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk, the Dene. It's sad and it's sick. This is, pluralism meant equal rights for everybody, except when it was inconvenient, forced assimilation, colonialism, and genocide for the indigenous people, but this strange patchwork approach to self-governing pluralistic minorities within one society. Now, I would say the United States never really bought into this the way that the British Empire did, the way that England itself did, Canada did. I assume Australia on the other side of the ocean did as well. South Africa would be another very interesting story to evaluate. I think it's completely obvious in 2020, perhaps much more obvious than the first example I used of the separation of powers doctrine, that this promise will not lead to any of the desirable outcomes that have been supposed, and indeed, looking back historically, that it never has been. Now, really simple example, evolution. Okay, let's throw in two. Evolution and the Holocaust. In the year 2020, this is a real issue in London, England right now, and in Toronto, Canada right now, of the government trying to cajole these Muslim-only schools to teach kids evolution and to teach them that the Holocaust really happened. Because these are communities where not just the teachers and not just the students, but often the parents, they may be deeply committed to a worldview that rejects evolution and rejects the factual history of what really happened during World War II with the Holocaust, right? What's your vision of this so-called pluralistic society? And then conversely, if you want to force these people to have a standardized secular education, You have to write it. You're oppressing them. That's oppression. You're taking children away from their parents, and you're forcing them to learn about things like evolution and history and politics and condoms and where babies come from. Think just in how to avoid getting HIV/AIDS, how to wash their hands, the germ theory of disease and vaccination. I mean, it's not easy to think of all the things that really the government and society absolutely wants to coerce minorities, however defined, religiously defined, ethnically defined, linguistically defined, or what have you. The coercive power of the state is inevitably and inexorably going to be used to demand this of all these communities. And the greatest tragedy of all is what this resulted in England and Canada was not a melting pot society, right? What it resulted in was the mutually impoverishing, invidious division of the society into tiny islands, each island looking across the gulf to the others with a mixture of mistrust, hatred, and derision. If you don't believe me, you can go out to suburbs of Canada where there's one apartment building over there where everyone's a Palestinian refugee, and like really across the parking lot, there's an apartment building where they're all Israelis. I had a neighborhood where, this is walking distance from me, where there were Brazilians from Portugal. Sorry, pardon me. Spoilers. There were Portuguese speakers from Brazil, and there were Portuguese speakers from Portugal, and they lived in mutually invidious separate communities. There were Greeks and Macedonians who still hate each other. Those are small communities, but still, I remember hearing about that, right? So now, and obviously in Canada, the one that's on the most enormous scale is the division between Francophone and Anglophone, right? And this has been preserved. They have separate schools, even in a place like Saskatchewan, even in Regina, like it's not just Quebec. Even in Regina, the Francophones and the Anglophones are separate and don't talk to each other and hate each other. So Melissa is here off camera. Melissa, have we ever once had a conversation with, had coffee with, had any interaction with the French-speaking minority?
You had an interview on your channel.
Oh, that's true. If you include YouTube, I've talked to one Francophone in the last 5-10 years in Canada. There was one Francophone working behind the counter of a hotel once, but the mutual isolation is real. And by the way, in case you didn't know, the French-speaking population tends to overlap with being Catholic, about 98%. So there's also a Catholic versus non-Catholic division there, so on and so forth. Okay? So this has been treated as the solution. It's the blueprint for a multicultural society in the British Empire. And I've already admitted to you that what people attribute to John Stuart Mill may only somewhat vaguely and imperfectly resemble the precise words of John Stuart Mill if you want to dig through the footnotes of what he wrote. Okay, this is one thing. But the other thing to remember is almost nobody actually reads John Stuart Mill anyway. People in power, whether in Canada, England, around the world, this is an incredibly influential doctrine. Mostly they just talk about multiculturalism. They talk about globalization. They talk about these, and they have no idea what the history is, how this emerged out of the British Empire conquering India. And by the way, the sincere concerns of John Stuart Mill and a few of his contemporaries about the fact that he lived in a society where it wasn't safe to be a homosexual, it wasn't safe to cheat on your wife. It's true. It really wasn't safe to be a Hindu living in Anglican England, and he saw the way Jews were treated quite badly by the Christian majority, and he really said, whoa. This democracy thing, which was already quite limited in England at that time, maybe democracy needs to be limited precisely because of the problem of the majority oppressing the minority. That really was the basis for the creation of multiculturalism as we now have it. And although, again, the influence was not as direct, I would say it's also underpinning a great deal of what we see today in the United States, whether it was employed cynically, as it definitely was in the post-World War II period with the creation of redlining policies, with the creation of separate schools for black people and white people, which was never constitutional. It was never even legal, but the United States government did it everywhere. I mean, an amazing kind of government conspiracy created racially segregated schools throughout your whole country. And a lot of that happened after World War II. I mean, obviously, some of it goes back to slavery, but you'd be surprised. A lot of it's not that ancient. Separation of, this is pluralism, right? This is the creation of an invidious divide. And it's an invidious divide that in 2020, when all of us can look into one another's eyes and see and appreciate one another's humanity in a way that was perhaps much more difficult in an era when, for most people, the only black person whose voice they ever heard was Louis Armstrong on the radio. I mean, that's real. You got, sorry again, if you're not as old as me, but when I was talking to people my grandparents' age, they really, there really was a time when who black people were was quite hard for them to understand. The only interface they had with black culture was through figures like Louis Armstrong and the very strange representation of African Americans in cinema here and there. They were a distant, mysterious people, Well, everything's gotten a lot less mysterious, and frankly, I think the political phenomenon of YouTube is a crucial part of that. I had one regular viewer of the channel write into me, and he said, and again, I know he has good intentions. He said that in my challenging these pluralistic assumptions, and in my challenging the thought-terminating cliche of left-wing people today saying that we should just listen to the voices of black people, we should just listen to the voices of transgender people, whoever the oppressed group is. In my taking this rather challenging and defiant, yet centrist and pragmatic view of politics in the 20th century, he said that I'm wrong. Because, and I know he has good intention saying this, because I can't know what it feels like to be an African American in the United States of America in the year 2020. I can't know what it feels like to be a transgender person in the United States of America in the year 2020. And this is a situation where I have to say, you are correct, but what you're saying is entirely spurious. Right? If I don't know, do you think that through research, I could know? This kind of knowledge, it's not passive, right? It's acquired. It's not innate. It's not natural. It's acquired through hard work. And like the whole discipline of social anthropology is based on the premise that by going out and doing research, including things like participant observation, a white Western outsider can go and live and work amongst tribal people in Papua New Guinea and can start to understand their cultures and start to understand their perceptions and start to understand what their concerns and interests are. Now, if you look at the members of parliament where you live, the members of your local state senate or whatever you've got, you may well think none of these people are going out and doing the work of a social anthropologist. Really, okay, let's talk about Canada's Indigenous people, which is by far our most oppressed minority. The Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, Mohawk, Iroquois, etc. Who among us, who in Parliament is going out and living in their communities and seeing their political problems? Who's actually going out and having that experience? That's a great question. I mean, who is there in the American Senate who's going out and living in, the slums of Chicago and is going and visiting their schools and looking at what the situation is and the problems of the education system and the economic problems, and it's looking at the policing problems and it's going to the precinct and talking to criminals? And that may indeed be a very fundamental problem with your system of government, whether in the United States, Canada, or in any other particular country. However, it's nevertheless very much false to say that therefore black people and black people alone should write the legislation that pertains to and governs black people, right? Now, a great example is the system of education, right? System of education in the United States is bad, and most people would agree it is especially bad for African Americans. It has been for about 200 years. It's gone through various phases, all right? And yet we all know that does not mean that, for example, the leaders of Black Lives Matter are the people who can design a new and better system of education. The people who can design and then legislate into existence a better system of education are going to be the people who do the research. That's it. That's the solution to the riddle. Right? The problem with the modern concept of democracy, not the ancient Athenian concept of democracy, is that it only answers the question of who gets what. It presumes that you've got a bunch of greedy children around a buffet table haggling over who's going to take what food from the buffet table. How are you going to divide up the riches of the state? And this is really a false optic. This is a misleading way to think about democracy, right? Democracy is and must always be a problem-solving method. I completely concede the point that protest can make a society aware of a problem, right? It can raise the question. And as pathetic a method as it is to protest, of burning down a Wendy's restaurant, I would not approve of lighting a Wendy's restaurant on fire for a vegan activist, promoting veganism, opposing meat eating. I wouldn't approve of it for Black Lives Matter activists. So I've been consistent on this through my whole political commentary career here on YouTube. I morally oppose it. However, if you concede the point that protesters lighting a restaurant on fire and burning it down, that this raises the question, it still leaves us with this tragedy of the protesters not being able to furnish the answers. And we live in societies where the constitutions we've written and the parliaments we've created are in absolutely no way designed to be research institutions, to include or reflect in any way expert opinion. How many medical doctors are in your system of parliament? How many nurses? And all of these countries have these endless negotiations between Parliament and the nurses' union, Parliament and the doctors' union, because there isn't representation for them already. They could have seats in Parliament. This doesn't take a genius to think this stuff through, right? Now, in Canada, I can ask the question, where's the representation in Parliament for the chiefs of the various tribes, for the Indigenous people? There isn't any. It was designed intentionally. It was designed intentionally to exclude them, even, so of course. And then you have these ridiculous negotiations between Parliament and local tribal governments and so on. Basically anywhere you see negotiations, you see something, and when you see domestic negotiations, it means there's something there you have to write into your constitution or write an entirely new constitution to avoid these negotiations. These are people who should be included in the democratic process, not negotiated with as if they're outsiders and opponents of that democratic process, all right? If you have a system of government that can't even cope with as well organized, as well funded a minority as medical doctors, how are you possibly going to reflect the opinions of the poor and downtrodden, be they African American, Native American, or otherwise? You have a completely surreal farce of a system of government in the United States. And the problem has been, up till now, up to 2020, the most fundamental questions of how to reform that society have only been asked by the lunatic fringe of left-wing extremists and right-wing extremists, be they communists, anarchists, or libertarians. There's been an unforgivable lack of concern and imagination from the moderate, pragmatic centrists. And the truth is, sometimes the most moderate and pragmatic thing you can do is to tear the government down and write a new constitution starting from a blank piece of paper. The Japanese did it, the French did it, I've mentioned Portugal did it. It's really not that daunting. You guys may not know this. This year, 2020, China didn't write a new constitution. They rewrote their entire corpus of law, the entire canon of civic law, the civic code or civil code, as you might say, was been rewritten. All law in China was rewritten in this year, right? It can be done. Napoleon did it in 6-8 months. I forget now, right? The Napoleonic Code. You can write new laws. You can find fundamentally new solutions to these problems. But we're emerging from a long period of pretending that these things didn't matter. When you read the Constitution of the United States of America, when you read the Constitution of France, there is no answer to the question of what the relationship between the police and members of the public ought to be. There is no answer to the question, how are you going to integrate Muslims and Muslim-majority schools into a Christian society or a secular society or an atheist society? What is the role of government in relation to governing these ethnic minorities? A whole long series of unexamined assumptions crept into and corrupted this system, and their effect was so corrosive precisely because the people involved in corrupting the system, like John Stuart Mill themselves, and like my viewer who wrote in with that suggestion, they perceived what they were doing as virtuous.